So I actually asked for a chair because I'm a bit of a granny, being over 30, so I'm going to sit down instead of pacing up and down. Thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure, and well done to Matteo and Patrick and the Shout Out team for putting together another great event. It's so important to make sure that the voices of young people are heard now more than ever, and so it's really, really important to have this. I'm here to apparently talk about why young people should be involved in politics, but you are the stalwarts. You are already interested in politics. Maybe I don't need to tell you. Having said that, there are three things that come to mind, and I've got my phone here not because I'm going to tweet, but because I've got some stats to put to you. Just three things that I want us to think about. The first one is to do with the economy. And last year, a study from the Equality and Human Rights Commission found that young people are now facing the worst economic prospects for several generations. That basically there are now more barriers for achieving economic independence and success than they did 5 years ago. And that's going to affect people in terms of income and employment. It's going to have knock-on effects in terms of housing. I'm sure lots of people are already familiar with this. And so when we think about that and what's going to happen to young people, particularly economically, whether that is in terms of their wages, whether that's in terms of whether they can get a job or not, whether that's in terms of their housing, we need to think very carefully about how politicians can be forced to listen to that voice. And I say forced because it's going to have to take that much energy. At the moment, what we know is in general elections, and I'll talk about the referendum in a second, but in general elections, we know that young people don't turn out to vote as much as they should. And so politicians don't have an incentive to act in favour of that whole generation. So it's going to take some really, really strong action, some really, really noticeable movements that really engage young people, and not just the kinds of young people who come to an event like this and already want to talk about politics. And so that's something that we're going to have to think very, very strongly about. And I've just managed to lock my phone, bear with me 1 second, for my second point in terms of stats. So the second point, it's not so much a stat, but it's a report, and I think it was actually out today. The Youth Parliament puts together various things, and one of the things they do is a Youth Select Committee, and they act exactly like a parliamentary select committee, and they hear evidence, and some of you may have come across it. And I thought that the thing that they put out today was very interesting. They talked about schools allowing racial discrimination and religious hatred to take place. And the exact quote that was given was that schools don't want racial discrimination to be seen. That young people were saying to them that they were worried that racist behaviour was becoming normalised, that it was being dismissed as banter. Now, I found that quite troubling, and one of the things, go and have a look at the report for more detail on this. I don't want to get too bogged down into that, but one of the things they were saying is that schools might be worried that they will come off looking bad in their Ofsted reports if it looks like that racial discrimination is taking place. And so the attitude was that you would make things seem like banter, that you would make seem things like they don't matter that much, when perhaps to some of these young people they did matter and they were forms of abuse. The things that we need to think about there are what might be banter in the school playground today might end up becoming the commentators of our newspaper pages, maybe not newspapers, maybe online. They will end up becoming the MPs, the columnists, the people who set the narrative in the future. And now some of you may already know that some of those people setting out the narratives aren't that nice. And anyone who's been on the rough end of that knows that. So if we want to decide the kind of society we want to live in, the kind of boundaries that we want to set out for what we find acceptable or unacceptable, and I'm not talking about limiting people's free speech, I'm talking about how we want to live with each other, then we need to start with what's happening in schools and in colleges and universities and actually take those issues seriously. So not only do we need to think about how we're going to force politicians to think about young people's prospects economically, we also need to think about how we're going to encourage society at the everyday level, whether it's in school or in colleges, how we're actually going to make people think about how they treat each other, what we see as acceptable, what is banter and what is abuse. And this is in the context of racism has always existed. Brexit did not make racism happen. But we do know that racial hatred crimes have gone up. We know that. I was just around the corner filming a couple of weeks ago on a story, completely nothing to do with the EU or immigration. It was a piece about air pollution. And one of the most polluted streets in the country is the Marylebone Road, just near Baker Street. And there's a primary school just off the street there. which is one of the most polluted roads in the country, and school kids have to walk up and down it. So we were outside filming, talking to mums about how they felt about air pollution. And it was a mixed group of mums. They were black, white, Muslim, Christian. Very much a London group of mums hanging out and talking about their kids. And while we were filming, talking to one of these mums, a man might pass and said, "Send them all back, get them all out of the country." And that's in central London. And I'm not very shocked by racism, because I've come across it a lot, both personally and professionally. But I still found it quite staggering that now people feel that it is normal to walk around in the middle of the day and yell abuse at a group of mums, purely for standing there talking to a camera about something entirely unrelated. So that's where we're at now, and we know this is fact, so nobody can deny that racial hatred crimes aren't taking place and they aren't going up. And the impact that that will have, particularly on young people who are still finding their identity, who may take abuse much more personally than someone who's gone through several layers of abuse and then knows what it's like. We need to think about how we're going to deal with that. And then the third one I want us to think about is Brexit itself. Now, Patrick mentioned some of this in terms of how young people voted. One of the myths, now I said already, we know that young people generally, in general elections, don't turn out to vote as much as older people. What we do know, though, is that that wasn't the case for the referendum. So there's a myth that young people didn't turn out to vote and older people did, and that's why the referendum went to leave. That is not true. A study from the LSE in July 2016 found that 64% of young people who were registered to vote did so. 65% of 25 to 39-year-olds did so, and 66% of 40 to 54-year-olds did so. So the way young people voted was no less than other age groups, except for those with 65 and over, and 70% of those chose to vote. So the very oldest voters did come out more strongly, but in terms of how younger people actually coming out to vote, it wasn't dissimilar to other age groups. So we need to get rid of this myth that somehow young people couldn't be bothered to vote in the referendum and they weren't engaged. We know that they were engaged. That said, Patrick mentioned some of these stats, but both YouGov and a poll by Lord Ashcroft suggested that between 71 or 73% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted to remain. Now, I'm not here to say Brexit is a terrible thing and young people all did not want Brexit to happen. Obviously, that's not the case. But when the numbers are that high, when an entire generation of young people very strongly wanted to vote Remain, we need to think about how the issues that they had in their minds, the worries that they had, the reasons that they wanted to stay in the EU can now be brought up to politicians, how they are now expressed through policies. And that's easier said than done, really, because at the moment, what isn't clear is what exactly is going to happen in terms of Brexit. I mean, we keep being told Brexit means Brexit, but no one actually knows what Brexit means. And so that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it means that younger people have a chance to shape it, that they can go and lobby their MPs, that they can come up with ideas as to what we want a future Britain post-Brexit to look like. So I think that's an opportunity more than anything. I think that's kind of the points that I wanted to make. As I say, as much as it is a scary time for lots of people, and a lot of young people have expressed concern about it being quite a worrying time, it is also an opportunity. And quite often in confusing times and what people might view as dark times, amazing, really positive, radical, and I mean radical in the good sense, movements can come out of that. And I think that is the spirit in which particularly young people should be encouraged to think about Brexit Britain. Thank you very much. If you've got any questions, I'm happy to take them.